Hello, my name is Oren, and I am a proponent of women's empowerment and women's rights. And it's interesting because in about 2014, the year 2014, about 8 years ago or so, I started a charity called Girl Justice, which was it was a women's empowerment charity that sought to build a platform that would raise money for women's charities, from the Malala Fund for girls' education to CamFed, also for girls' education, to the Komen Research Center for breast cancer, etc. And my thinking was that there are so many topics about women empowerment that we overlook in this community of people that are supporters of women's rights and women's freedoms, women's empowerment in general. And what's interesting is that over the last 60 years, the metaphor for women's rights and the discussion in the public forum about whether women can achieve their rights, this discussion is centered around the rights of abortion. And, I think that was possibly staged by a man who once said that we're going to make it so that the only right that women get to protest about is the right to abort their own fetuses. And I think that's disgusting that that's what women's rights became. Though many men are supporters of the right to choose, many men are pro-life, including many women. What I'm getting at is that the feminist movement should not be about whether a woman has a right to abort her own child before they're born. Like, that's not what it means to be a woman in America, or for that matter in the world. We see incidents on the television, on the news, for example, like 2014, I want to think it was 2014, maybe 2015, when Ray Rice punched his girlfriend. And it was a big, big, huge, chaotic, frenetic news story cycle about Ray Rice and the domestic violence that he did to his girlfriend. And he was fined by the NFL. The NFL made a stance on domestic violence. And for a little while, domestic violence was a topic in America, in the American conversation. And we started to see that people, care about women's rights, like preventing domestic violence in relationships. And then of course it went back to normal, and the topics, became more about abortion rights again. But for a brief moment in time, the women's rights movement was about something more than abortion. Now, I've identified about 15 different areas that I think are perfectly pertinent for women to support, or perhaps to work on more than support. 15 different causes or topics that if a woman could, in addition, so most women, they support the right to choose and some don't, they're pro-life, etc. But what if you had an additional topic in addition to the abortion rights, and you supported that women's empowerment topic just as much as the abortion topic, right? So these are the 15 topics. First, we have domestic violence. There are so many women in relationships, whether they're married to their husband or it's just a boyfriend, or even casual sex, or whatever's going on, somewhere in between, a little shade of gray. Domestic violence is a topic that many women deal with. About 20% of women are reportedly dealing with domestic violence in America. So that number is possibly higher, and possibly higher in the truth. You see what I mean? So what's interesting is, you could choose domestic violence as a topic to focus on. You see what I mean? And then women protest domestic violence just as much, and that could be another topic for some women in addition to talking about abortion rights. But then it gets kind of interesting because the women's rights movement really evolved, with respect to the war in Afghanistan and the soldiers out there in Afghanistan. That some are still out there, many came home. It's publicly declared it over in my at least in my news cycle. But I know some soldiers still remain there. And what was relevant to women about Afghanistan was this young woman named Malala. And she was 18 years old at the time. She was riding the bus to school for the very last time, or something to the effect. And some Taliban men got on the bus and they shot her in the head. And somehow, by the grace of God, by the miracles of her faith and her human body, she survived the headshot. And she had been a proponent of girls' education in Afghanistan. And we forget in America how good we have it, right? And the same in Latin America. We forget how good we have it. Same in Europe. We forget how good we have it. There's a few regions in the world that are really just perfectly developed and, have a great economy, have a great news cycle. Everything's going beautifully. We're getting educated. We're getting jobs. We're getting hired. We're getting married, making a family. Everything's going great. But at the same time, there are a lot of parts of the world where it's not so great. I mean, India has a huge middle class. Their middle class is about 250 million people, and they're middle class. But it's a country of 1.5 billion people. So that means there's still 1 billion people that are underneath the middle class. They're not doing that great. So it's sort of similar because it's the same in China, about the same numbers. And Africa has a middle class in every country, especially in Kenya. They have a nice middle class. Nairobi, Nigeria, Lagos, they have a nice middle class out there. But there's still like way too much abject poverty, right? And when there's abject poverty, that also leads to lack of access to education for both boys and girls. But if you're a feminist or you're a women's rights supporter or a supporter of women's empowerment, then you might say that supporting girls' education might be something that we could focus on for all those young people in the developing world. They don't necessarily have access to that education. And that's a topic that's really important. So one of the unnecessary but interesting byproducts of sort of a silver lining approach of the war in Afghanistan was this story about Malala and her subsequent organization, the Malala Fund. Now she's living in London. She's having a beautiful time. She's living, she's getting educated. She's basically just educating herself, and that's a beautiful thing. But she's also running the Malala Fund, which became this charity about building schools for girls in Afghanistan and everywhere else in the Middle East and the developing world and everywhere in the ballpark. So there are many of you that might say that now, because of her and her leadership and the subsequent news cycle about it, that girls' education is also a topic that is equally as important to women's rights and women's freedoms and feminists as abortion, right? These are all, so we have domestic violence and girls' education as two topics that if we focus on these topics just as much as abortion, I think it would evolve the women's movement to really have a more holistic, integrative approach, right? Because right now, the whole movement for women's rights in general, it's very abortion driven. But if it was more holistic and integrative, it would be more inclusive of all these different topics. So I'm going to briefly go over the other topics that matter, and there's about 15 of them. But I'll just mention a few right now, and we'll just kind of keep it quick. So the next one is poverty. There are so many people in the world who are very poor, right? I think the number is that 80% of the population of Earth makes $10 a day or less. And then that was about 10 years ago. That statistic was good about 10 years ago, so we might update that. But then the other interesting number was about 3 billion people were making $3 a day or less on Earth. So that's like a third to half of the population of Earth, right? Making $3 a day or less. And that's a lot of money. That's part of my statement. That's a lot of money for nobody. You know what I mean? And that's very little money, actually. And that's, it's sort of unacceptable that we live so beautifully with our electricity and our art over here and, all our accoutrements, etc. And yet at the same time, what we're finding is that, that half of the world at least is in poverty. I mean, really deep poverty, up like making $10 a day or less for at least half the world. Now, half the world, and then half of those people, and that half of the world are women, right? So that's like a quarter of the world is making like $3 a day or less, and that quarter is women. So I think that like fundamentally that men in America, and women might agree as well, would say that if you're making $3 a day in America, then America kind of takes ownership of most situations. The economy, certainly. We take ownership of the global economy more than any other country. We guide and oversee the economy. We oversee Latin America with the Washington Consensus, which is working, by the way. It's going great for Latin America. We love how Latin America's developing. That's beautiful. But in general, there's still a lot of poverty, right, in most parts of the developing world. Now, Latin America is much more developed than ever before, and it's really interesting to see it because Brazil is like a thriving, vibrant economy. Chile, Argentina, thriving, vibrant economies, right? Uruguay, Paraguay, thriving, beautiful economy. Colombia is doing great. It looks beautiful. It's Medellin is an incredible city, developed, skyscrapers, everything. So it's not as much. It's not as poor as you'd expect it to be, right? But the point of the matter is, there's still a lot of poverty out there, right? And half of the people that are in poverty, more or less, are women. And not only are they women and girls, but they end up raising families, and you don't want these families to be raised under abject, impoverished conditions. So poverty might be another topic you might want to focus on as a woman in terms of, or maybe it's opposite, abundance, So if you're a woman or a man who supports women's rights, maybe a parent of a daughter or a mother herself or a daughter herself, or even her brothers and sisters, or a man who just supports women in general, you might say, okay, domestic violence, that makes sense. We don't want women getting hit. Check, that makes sense. Girls' education, that makes sense. Poverty, that makes sense. I didn't know there was so much poverty in the world. Maybe I'll do something about it. Start a charity, start a Tom's Shoes kind of company, one of those. So, you might do something about it. And then the fourth topic is women's health. And women's health is, usually looked at from the lens of abortion, right? But at the same time, women's health could be just a woman in relation to her doctor, right? So you have male doctors and female patients, and then there's a power dynamic there, and then it doesn't always go in the direction of justice. It doesn't always go in the direction of health. So women's health is a major topic that women might focus on. So that's interesting. Next up, sexual assault. Now, we know that there's a lot of women who have reported getting, so to speak, raped or whatever, evil, to the authorities, and it tends not to go in the direction of the prosecution. About 98% of rape cases end up with a not guilty or a case dismissed or some form of contest. So women don't really have the right to protest. Women don't really have the protest at the courts, but it's still a topic that, I think female attorneys could focus on that, and they could protect their daughters and other people's daughters with a lens of, if it's not going to get handled in the court system, then what can women do, non-violently, certainly, and non to make it so that women are safe, in near the bedroom, and so that we don't have men coming in and doing horrible things, and it's just a topic that women have known about the whole time, and it's getting better every generation, is my understanding. And the millennial generation is certainly more consensual, right, than any other generation we've ever had, except for maybe Gen Z underneath us. Not in that sense. But in any event, sexual assault is a topic, right, that women focus on. But they don't really include it in the women's rights movement. But if they did, some of them, that would make a difference. So there's that topic. And then, of course, the next one, breast cancer, is a really big topic too. We have Komen for the Cure. We have the pink ribbons. And those make a really big difference, right? So when you have women uniting to stop, breast cancer, for example, then that really makes a big difference for women to protect each other. So breast cancer is another women's rights movement. It's another women's empowerment movement, certainly, right? So it's not all about abortion. Now, as for me, I've been a little pro-choice, a little pro-life, and I've gone back and forth in my life, and it's not, it's not something I want to talk about. But the point of the matter is, whether you're pro-choice or pro-life, right? The point is this: women's rights is more than just abortion rights. Women's rights has to do with girls' education, making sure women aren't getting hit, making sure women aren't poor, making sure they have health rights. A Bill of Rights for women with doctors, for example. Make sure they're not getting assaulted in or outside of the bedroom. Making sure that we're developing cures for breast cancer, for example. There's a laundry list of items, and I'll just read the rest from now because we can't really get into all of them in this video. I guess we could, but so the point of the matter is, there's a laundry list of things that are like, when you're in women's empowerment and women's rights as a movement, as a feminist, as a person who supports women, then you say, which topic, in addition to the abortion movement, am I focusing on? Because there are so many areas of women's empowerment that women are already relatively united about, but it's more latent unity. It's not conscious unity, because we're not really talking about it that much. So we need to talk about these topics more. Female genital cutting, that's a danger. It's especially in Africa and the developing world, they do that a lot, but sometimes you hear about it in Europe and America, and it's kind of edgy. So there are charities like Orchid Foundation, which seeks to protect women from that, and protect women from that is very important, I would say. So pretty scary stuff, especially when you're a father in general. So that's something you want to protect and possibly work on. And then we'll go to the easier topics like self-esteem. Women having self-esteem issues, like that's part of the women's empowerment movement too, because when you have high self-esteem, you're a higher performer, you perform better, you become stronger, you're a stronger mother, a stronger leader, a stronger woman, etc. All the same, So self-esteem, that's important. I don't want to gloss over it, but that's a very important topic, self-esteem. And then women's rights in legislation, political rights for women. That's another aspect of the women's rights movement that is really important. And you've heard, of course, about the Equal Rights Amendment they put up in the 70s. to talk about how women were seeking to have equal rights to men in the U.S. Constitution. But you got to look back at the history of everything. I mean, the 1970s was a really complicated time because we hadn't been at war with Vietnam for 10 years. So when the country's at war, the military has the power, right? And the military is generally very male dominated. So they tried to move for the Equal Rights Amendment at a time when the military had all the power in the country. So it went according to the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army didn't really worry about women's rights at the time. It was worried about protecting its troops in Vietnam. So the point of the matter is that if you want to promote women's rights through legislation, you might want to do it at a time when your country isn't at war, or at a time when your country is healing and coming together. So that's kind of interesting. So women's rights in terms of political legislation. So we have the Ledbetter Act that happened to the Obama administration, equal pay for equal work. That's very important. This is legislation that moves women forward. That's women's rights in legislation politically. So when you move women's rights, and then you have the SESTA Act, the FOSTA Act, that Trump signed into law that help protect women from sex trafficking and minimize sex trafficking to the extent allowed by the law. So you have a lot of women's rights legislation, and that's very important. And if you're an attorney, a female attorney, a male attorney who loves women, who's a feminist, but you might have latent, sexism in you that you're not aware of, kind of a thing. You might want to look into different ways that you can protect women and empower them through legislation, because that's the god, of women's rights right there. Is getting the legislation passed, getting the amendments passed, etc. And just to say, they might not make the Equal Rights Amendment law, but you could just as easily take the language of the Equal Rights Amendment from the 1970s, update it for the 21st century, and make it a bill that goes through Congress, and then only needs a 50% approval by the Congress, and then a presidential sign. So that's kind of interesting. So you could get in with legislation instead of as an amendment, which doesn't put it in the Constitution, but it still makes it law, and that's powerful. So there's a lot of ways to do that. So that's women's rights. And then, of course, you have other topics like girl infanticide. Girl infanticide is when, especially in impoverished regions, poor parts of the country, of the world, rather, sorry, it might happen in America too. You never know. But poor parts of the world, such as Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Africa, etc. Different parts of Latin America maybe, where they say that the woman gets pregnant and they don't have a lot of money in their family because they're very poor. They make like $5 a day or whatever. And there's a lot of people that make $5 a day in this world. There's a lot of poverty out there. So you have people out there, and they're making $5 a day, and so the dad says to the mom that look, I want a boy, and if it's a girl, it's killed. And the mom says, well, no, I'm a woman, so it's not killed. But then there's a power dynamic there that doesn't always work in their direction. So sometimes the fathers, after the mother gives birth and they see that it's a daughter, sometimes the men kill the daughter, sometimes, this little baby, and they extinguish a life right after birth. And it's like, this is a horrific practice. It's called girl infanticide. Research it. It's a real topic. If you believe in women's rights and women's empowerment globally, and not just for your own women, for example, for American women in America, or Canadian women in Canada, or a Chilean woman in Chile, for example, but for women everywhere in the world, it might make a difference for you to say, okay, girl infanticide makes a difference to me as a person who supports women, even if it's somewhere else in the developing world. So we might want to fix that and work on that. So that's kind of interesting too. A couple more. Maternal care, right? So that's another topic that women can unite around, because women going to the doctor and getting care as a mother before the baby is born, during the birth, and immediately after the birth of the baby in the following months, there's maternal care, and it's a special kind of care with a special kind of doctor, an OBGYN, for example. And then you have, how good is that care? What is the quality of care? Is it sufficient everywhere in the world, or is it insufficient somewhere? And then if it is insufficient in certain areas, we might want to work on that and possibly make some improvements. And Americans generally donate about $200 billion a year to charity every year. I mean, America is a wealthy country. We raise so much money for charity. So, you can then vote with your charity dollars, so to speak, as like a citizen, consumer, citizen, charitable supporter. Say I'm going to donate $100 to this woman's charity that supports maternal care, and next thing you know, then that charity gets more money, and they can do a better job and protect more women, and that's very valuable. So the women's rights movement is more than just about aborting unborn children. It's also about giving mothers of children, whether born or not yet born, access to the health care that they need to make a better, more successful childbirth for both the mother and the daughter. And then you can get into how C-sections, which happen in American hospitals, how those aren't necessarily good for women at all. Then maybe the baby comes out, but we think the C-sections are very invasive, sign a lot of people, and a lot of doctors defer to them, and perhaps these are doctors that don't like women too much. The doctors that do like women probably don't do C-sections. They probably just get it out of the way. So there are a lot of medical things that happen in America too, related to maternal care, especially C-sections and other things, that just are not acceptable, right? And they still happen with alarming regularity. So that's something to think about. Then you go, you can recall when George W. Bush was the president. He did a big initiative in Africa to combat the HIV/AIDS virus, right? And we put hundreds of millions of dollars towards it as a nation. And, part of it's compassionate conservatism, you could say. So HIV is a topic that half of the people that it affects are women. So some of you are very sexually active, and you might say, okay, then I'm going to support that charity to stay safe, or whatever your rationale. I don't know what it is. There's a lot of people that believe, right, that protecting women from HIV, especially in Africa, where it's more prevalent than in the United States, for example, where it's pretty minimized. Minimized. So, but that's a topic that, a lot of women, it's like a life or death topic elsewhere in the world, right? So you start to get that global sort of, understanding about women, that there's all this laundry list of stuff that women are suffering from. And, so therefore, when I'm protesting for my rights, I might think about all these topics as opposed to just that one topic, right? Which is abortion. But at the same time, I might say, there's a lot of topics about women that are just as important for women. And if we focus on all of them in an integrative way, holistically, we might actually change the narrative. Because men, just as much as women, are polarized about the abortion issue in America. Half the men hate abortion rights, and half the men hate taking away access to abortion. And the men are just as passionate and powerful about abortion as women to a certain extent, because Democrats are generally pro-choice, and Republicans are generally pro-life. So the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are at odds about this. And however the Supreme Court ends up, making their decision, and even 50 years later, however that goes, you might say the men are just as passionate about it, and then they go away to their jobs and to visit their families on vacation or whatever it is. And the point is, they don't extrapolate women's rights outside of that topic. So then there's men in America, and they say women's rights, abortion, that makes sense, and then that's the extent of how much they care about women. It's like, yeah, but we let you have abortions on the men, so that's good enough. You see what I mean? And they go, and then what's that? So, and that's kind of funny. But what's interesting is we don't, make women's empowerment, relevant to the men from all these laundry list of things that are so relevant to women. So a couple more and then we'll be done. Child marriage is another major topic. You hear about it in the Southeast Asia a lot, in Africa sometimes too, where you hear about these daughters are 10 years old, they're 15 years old, and their parents are getting them married. And usually it's because of money, right? Because there's a dowry, and then, the family gets another $1,000 from this guy over here with $10,000 in whatever country it is. It could be, Afghanistan, it could be Pakistan, whatever it is, you never know. So for $1,000, they give their 10 to 15-year-old daughter away. And next thing you know, they have the money and they survive, and the daughter is now protected by this another man, and she's generally under the age of consent anyway, and then they expect regular sex, they expect you to cook clean, and then you're not getting an education anymore because you're married to this man, but you're like 8 to 12 years old. Really creepy. There's millions of daughters going into child marriages every year throughout the world. It's a very dangerous, major topic. We really need to make the global age of marriage consent, so to speak, 18 or above. And that's a very crucial. And that's a topic that everyone in America can get around, because it's about marriage. America is such a marriage-oriented country. 2 more, and then we're done. So one more that I think is, you hear about it every now and then. Women know about it, but most men have never heard of it before. It's called fistula. A fistula is when your vagina sort of breaks, kind of a thing. So like broke, there's a thing for it. And by having sex, it's either too rough or too hard or too much penetration or too big or whatever it is, and it breaks the vagina. It's a very painful procedure to repair it, a special surgery kind of a thing. This happens in the developing world, perhaps more than in America or Europe, or Latin America, for example, but it's still something that you hear about, and it is an issue, and there are charities about it, women's charities that just say, well, you donate it to us $100, and that covers 5 surgeries for a woman, for 5 women that had a fistula. There are so many, and for every topic I'm mentioning on this longer list of video, every topic, you're seeing charities that are formed for the express purpose of covering it, right? So you're starting to see it that there's a laundry list of topics related to women's rights, and every single one of them has merit, and every single one of them has value. And when you are able to cover it, so to speak, by when you are able to support a woman outside of the abortion clinic, but also in maternal health care, in the hospitals, with babies and their rights, girl infanticide, so to speak, preventing that, self-esteem issues and making that, higher self-esteem for girls in America, everywhere else, women's health, breast cancer, poverty as a major issue, just to lift up women economically, to lift up women in terms of girls' education, domestic violence. There's a lot of those things you can get behind all these topics and support them. And when you do, that makes you more thorough of a feminist. You're more thorough feminist. You know what I mean? So then the last topic I wanted to talk about is women in the workplace. And there was a book I read about, I guess, 8 years ago by Sheryl Sandberg, who was the chief operating officer of Facebook. And Sheryl Sandberg wrote a book called Lean In. And it was, it was about women in the workplace. And it was all about, you have women. They're working in corporate America. They're working for small and medium-sized businesses, and how young women, especially millennial women and Gen Z women, can take action, sort of lean on to the attention that women experience in the workplace, and sort of get their rights get the right, sort of like as the stock market appreciates value, get their rights appreciated, get their rights highly valued, get their work more valued, equal pay for equal work being some of that. So you have this topic of women in the workplace, and if you were to ask a millennial woman in her 30s, right, if women have the same amount of rights as men in the workplace, she would probably say not at all. Like, men are so racist and sexist towards women, in the workplace. And it's a very male-dominated industry. We don't get to speak up. We're often belittled. We're often thought that we're not really, in a mode of competence where we're just as competent, if not more competent. I might have an MBA and he doesn't. He questions my business skills, which questions my education. So there's a million ways that women have been questioned in the workplace. So building, gender equity in the workplace, that's a major topic, is really valuable. And so it's kind of impressive that we're starting to see gender equity as a major topic, in our core, core conversations as a culture. So, that's kind of interesting to me, that women in the workplace is another area where you can support women's rights and women's empowerment. So as I conclude this message, I thank you so much for spending the time and watching this video and learning about all the different causes that support women and girls in the world. I think that we can come around to an agreement that, as much as passionate as the Democratic Party is about abortion rights, and as passionate as the Republican Party is about pro-life values and the values of the fetus, etc., both sides equally just passionate about abortion and whether it's legal or not. There's a laundry list of issues about women's rights that you can equally support that are just as important for women and girls in the world. Domestic violence, girls' education, poverty, women's health, sexual assault, breast cancer, female genital mutilation, self-esteem, women's rights politically, girl infanticide, maternal care, HIV, child marriage, women in the workplace, and fistula. These are 15 issues that don't have anything to do with abortion, right? But if you could support one of these issues as passionately as you supported your right to choose, or the opposite thereof, then you would be doing so much to support women's rights and freedoms in America and everywhere in the world. And that would be very worthwhile. So thank you very much for watching this video, so to speak, this conversation about women's rights and freedoms in the modern world in the 21st century. I think that when you watch a video like this, you might get inspired to either support a charity that supports these values, right? Or perhaps start a charity yourself, maybe start a blog about it. There's a lot of different things you can do to support women and their rights, whether you believe in abortion or not. So girls' education is really popular. Gender equity also really popular. So, support one of these topics, and then we'll see that women have value everywhere. Thank you.